The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Margaret Thompson, a 78-year-old widow from Manchester, clutching her worn handbag and peering through thick glasses at the magnificent red-coated guards standing motionless at their posts. Margaret had dreamed of this moment for decades. After her husband Harold passed away 2 years ago, she had finally found the courage to take the train to London alone. This ceremony represented more than just tourism for her. It was a promise she had made to Harold on his deathbed, that she would see the world they had always planned to explore together but never could afford to visit. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony time approached. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had been troubling her since her recent doctor visits, but she pushed the discomfort aside. Nothing would ruin this day. She had saved for months, staying in a modest bed and breakfast in Camden, eating simple meals, all so she could stand here in this historic place. Guard Corporal James Mitchell stood perfectly still in his traditional bearskin hat and scarlet tunic, his rifle held precisely at his side. At 26 years old, he had served in the household division for 4 years, having completed tours in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duties at the palace. The role required absolute discipline. Guards were trained never to break formation, never to respond to tourists, never to show emotion or movement unless commanded. James had grown up in a working-class family in Liverpool. His father worked in the shipyards, his mother cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. When James announced he wanted to join the army, his parents worried but understood his desire to serve something greater than himself. The pride in their eyes when he first donned the ceremonial uniform made every moment of rigorous training worthwhile. Standing at attention for hours required mental strength James had developed through meditation and visualization techniques. He would focus on a single point, control his breathing, and let his mind wander to calm places while his body remained perfectly disciplined. Today, however, something felt different. The crowd seemed more restless, the air heavier with anticipation and the unusual warmth of an early autumn day. Margaret shuffled slightly, trying to get a better view between the taller tourists in front of her. A group of teenagers with their phones held high blocked her line of sight, and she moved a few steps to her left. The exertion made her breathing more labored, but her excitement overrode any physical discomfort. She checked her small digital camera, making sure the battery had enough power to capture this historic moment. Behind her, a young mother struggled to manage twin toddlers while her husband attempted to take family photos. The children were crying, hungry and overwhelmed by the crowds. To Margaret's right, an elderly Japanese couple consulted a worn guidebook, pointing excitedly at the guards and whispering to each other in their native language. The international nature of the crowd reminded Margaret of Harold's stories about the diverse people he met during his brief service in the Royal Navy decades earlier. The sound of approaching drums grew louder as the new guard approached from Wellington Barracks. The crowd's energy intensified, people pushing forward to get better photographs and views. Margaret found herself pressed between a tall German tourist and a family from Australia, all of whom seemed to tower over her small frame. James noticed the increased movement in the crowd from his peripheral vision. His training had taught him to be aware of potential security threats while maintaining his ceremonial stance. He observed the usual mix of tourists, families with children, elderly couples, young backpackers, and photography enthusiasts with expensive camera equipment. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet he remained alert. The ceremony commander's voice rang out across the courtyard as the formal inspection began. Margaret strained to hear every word, wanting to remember each detail to share with her sister back home. She had promised to call that evening with a full report of her London adventure. The precision and pageantry amazed her. The perfectly synchronized movements, the gleaming instruments of the military band, the centuries of tradition being performed before her eyes. As the guards began their intricate ceremonial movements, Margaret felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She attributed it to excitement and the warmth of standing in the crowd for over an hour. She had skipped breakfast that morning, too nervous and excited to eat, surviving only on the weak tea provided by her bed and breakfast. James executed each movement with practiced precision, his muscle memory guiding him through the complex drill. Years of training had made these movements automatic, allowing his conscious mind to remain aware of his surroundings. Something in the crowd caught his attention, a subtle shift in energy. a disturbance that felt different from the usual tourist excitement. Margaret's vision began to blur slightly. The red uniforms seemed to blend together, and the sounds of the ceremony became muffled. She gripped her handbag tighter, trying to steady herself against the swaying sensation that was becoming more pronounced. The crowd around her remained focused on the ceremony, cameras clicking and children pointing excitedly at the guards. The morning had started perfectly for Margaret. She had awakened early, carefully dressed in her best outfit, a navy blue dress that Harold had always complimented, comfortable walking shoes, and her mother's vintage brooch pinned to her lapel. She had studied maps of London the night before, planning her route to ensure she arrived with plenty of time to secure a good viewing spot. During the train journey from Manchester, Margaret had struck up conversations with fellow travelers heading to London. A young businessman had given her tips about navigating the underground system, while a retired teacher had recommended other historical sites she might enjoy visiting during her 3-day stay. These interactions had boosted her confidence about traveling alone for the first time in her life. James had also begun his day early, participating in the pre-ceremony inspection at 6 a.m. His uniform was immaculate, each button polished to perfection, his boots gleaming like mirrors. The household division maintained the highest standards of presentation, and James took personal pride in exceeding expectations. His sergeant had nodded approvingly during the uniform inspection, a subtle sign of approval that meant everything to the young corporal. The weight of his bearskin hat and the layers of his ceremonial uniform created additional challenges during warm weather. But James had learned to manage these discomforts through mental discipline and proper hydration before ceremonies. He had eaten a substantial breakfast and consumed plenty of water, knowing he would need to maintain his position for extended periods without breaks. Margaret's breathing became more shallow as the ceremony progressed. The combination of excitement, the warm weather, her skipped breakfast, and the underlying heart condition her doctor had recently identified created a perfect storm of physical stress. She tried to focus on the beautiful music of the military band, using it as an anchor to maintain her composure. The crowd around Margaret remained oblivious to her growing distress. Everyone's attention was fixed on the spectacular display of military precision unfolding before them. Cameras captured every moment, children asked endless questions, and tour guides provided commentary in multiple languages. The energy was festive and celebratory, making Margaret's quiet struggle invisible to those surrounding her. James noticed a subtle change in the crowd's energy. His peripheral vision detected what appeared to be movement different from the usual tourist shuffling and positioning for photographs. Years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, even when he couldn't immediately identify the source of his concern. The ceremony reached its crescendo as the old guard prepared to march away and the new guard assumed their positions. This was the moment Margaret had traveled so far to witness, the culmination of her long-held dream. She raised her small camera with trembling hands, determined to capture this historic moment despite her growing physical discomfort. Margaret's legs felt increasingly unsteady. The dizziness that had been manageable was now becoming overwhelming. She tried to take deep breaths, but the press of the crowd made it difficult to get enough air. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite her attempts to remain composed and dignified. James completed his final ceremonial movement and assumed his new guard position. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the section of crowd where his instincts had detected the earlier disturbance. He maintained his military bearing while scanning the area with practiced subtlety. Margaret felt the world begin to tilt around her. The red uniforms, the golden instruments, the sea of faces in the crowd all began to blur together. She reached out instinctively, trying to find something solid to steady herself, but there was nothing within reach except the bodies of strangers pressed close around her. The realization that she was about to faint hit Margaret with crystal clarity. In that moment, she thought of Harold and how disappointed he would be that she couldn't even manage to complete this simple dream they had shared. She thought of her sister, waiting for her phone call that evening. She thought of all the planning and saving that had brought her to this moment. James saw her then, the small, elderly woman in the navy blue dress, swaying slightly among the taller tourists. Her face had turned pale. Her grip on her handbag was loosening, and she was beginning to lean backward. In that instant, James faced a choice that would define not only his military career, but his character as a human being. The rules were absolute. Maintain position, never break formation, never respond to civilian needs during ceremony. These weren't suggestions, but fundamental requirements of his role as a Queen's Guard. Breaking these rules could result in disciplinary action, demotion, or dismissal from the prestigious position he had worked years to achieve. But James also saw something else in that moment. His own grandmother, who had raised him after his parents divorced when he was 12. Margaret reminded him of the woman who had taught him about kindness, compassion, and doing what was right regardless of personal consequences. His grandmother had always told him that true strength wasn't about following rules blindly, but about knowing when humanity demanded action. Margaret's knees buckled slightly. The tourists around her were still focused on the ceremony, unaware that someone among them was in distress. Time seemed to slow as James watched her begin to fall, her small frame disappearing among the crowd of taller observers. In that split second, James made his decision. Every fiber of his military training screamed against it, but his human conscience demanded action. He could not stand motionless and watch an elderly woman collapse without assistance, regardless of the personal and professional consequences he would face. The crowd continued their enthusiastic observation of the ceremony, cameras clicking and children pointing excitedly at the guards. None of them noticed the internal struggle playing out in the mind of Corporal James Mitchell, or the elderly woman who was about to need his help more than she had ever needed anything in her 78 years of life. Margaret's final conscious thought before the blackness claimed her was surprise at how peaceful it felt to let go, and a small hope that someone might help her, even though she was just a stranger in a crowd of thousands. James watched Margaret's body begin its inevitable fall toward the hard cobblestones of the palace courtyard. Time moved in slow motion as he processed the life-changing decision he was about to make. Every muscle in his trained body wanted to spring into action, while every rule he had memorized demanded he remain perfectly still. In the space of a heartbeat, James abandoned 4 years of ceremonial training and broke formation. His polished black boots echoed against the cobblestones as he stepped forward, his red tunic a blur of motion against the backdrop of his motionless fellow guards. The heavy bearskin hat threatened to slip from his head as he moved with urgency toward the collapsing woman. His rifle remained perfectly positioned in his left hand, even as his right reached out to catch Margaret before she hit the ground. The crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Thousands of tourists who had been focused on the formal ceremony suddenly turned their attention to this unprecedented breach of protocol. Camera phones swung from the official guards to capture this unexpected human drama unfolding before their eyes. Children stopped mid-point to stare at the guard, who was moving, talking, behaving like a regular person instead of a living statue. "Are you all right, ma'am?" James asked softly as he caught Margaret under her arms, supporting her weight as she sagged against him. Her small frame felt fragile in his strong arms, and he could feel her labored breathing against his chest. The familiar weight of his ceremonial uniform suddenly felt insignificant compared to the responsibility of caring for this vulnerable stranger. Margaret's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and confused. She saw the red fabric of his tunic, the golden details of his uniform, and for a moment couldn't understand why one of the guards was so close to her. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, so sorry. Didn't mean to cause trouble." "You're not causing any trouble," James replied, his Liverpool accent gentle despite the formal setting. "Let's get you somewhere you can sit down properly." He began guiding her away from the dense crowd toward a nearby barrier where she could rest against something solid. The tourists around them formed a spontaneous circle, some offering help while others continued photographing this remarkable scene. A middle-aged American woman stepped forward, opening her purse. "I have water if she needs it," she offered. A retired doctor from Scotland pushed through the crowd, announcing his medical credentials and asking if he could assist. James felt the weight of hundreds of stares, but his focus remained entirely on Margaret's well-being. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, and the consequences would come later. Right now, an elderly woman needed help, and nothing else mattered. His military training in first aid kicked in as he assessed her condition. Pale skin, clammy to the touch, shallow breathing, but conscious and responsive. Behind them, the ceremony continued with mechanical precision. The remaining guards maintained their positions despite the unprecedented distraction occurring mere meters away. Their training allowed them to compartmentalize, to continue their duties even as their fellow guard faced what could be career-ending consequences for his actions. But James caught subtle glances from some of his colleagues, not disapproval, but understanding, even respect. Sergeant Major Williams, the senior non-commissioned officer overseeing the ceremony, had noticed the disturbance immediately. His first instinct was anger at the breach of protocol, followed quickly by concern for both the civilian in distress and the young corporal who had just jeopardized his military career. Williams faced his own difficult decision: maintain the ceremony's dignity or address the humanitarian crisis unfolding in full view of international media and tourists. Margaret's breathing began to stabilize as James helped her sit on a small folding chair that a quick-thinking tourist had produced from somewhere. The cool shade away from the dense crowd provided immediate relief, and the bottled water offered by the American woman helped restore some color to her cheeks. She looked up at James with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger in uniform. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "I came all the way from Manchester to see this ceremony. It was my husband's dream. Our dream. I didn't want to spoil it for everyone else." James knelt beside her chair, his formal posture abandoned in favor of human connection. "You didn't spoil anything, ma'am. Sometimes the most important moments happen when we least expect them." His words carried a wisdom that seemed to surprise even him, as if this experience was teaching him something fundamental about duty and humanity that no military manual had ever contained. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, forming multiple rings around this impromptu scene. Many were from different countries, speaking various languages, but the human drama transcended linguistic barriers. Some took photos, others offered assistance, and many simply watched with expressions of admiration for the guard who had chosen compassion over protocol. A uniformed police officer assigned to crowd control at the ceremony approached the group. Constable Sarah Mackenzie had been watching the situation develop and needed to assess whether medical intervention was required. She spoke briefly with James, her professional demeanor masking her personal admiration for his quick action. "How are you feeling now, love?" Constable Mackenzie asked Margaret, using the gentle tone she reserved for elderly citizens. Her presence added an official dimension to the situation, but also provided additional support and resources if Margaret needed more intensive medical attention. Margaret's color had improved significantly, and her breathing had returned to normal. "Much better, thank you. Just got a bit overwhelmed by the excitement, I think. And I didn't eat breakfast this morning. Silly of me, really." She attempted to stand, wanting to demonstrate that she was recovering and didn't need to continue disrupting the ceremony. James remained close, ready to provide support if she needed it. His decision to break formation had been instinctive, but now he was fully committed to ensuring Margaret's complete recovery. The consequences of his actions would come later. For now, his duty was clear and personal rather than institutional. The American woman who had offered water introduced herself as Linda Patterson, a retired nurse from Texas. She had been watching Margaret carefully and was impressed by her resilience. "You remind me of my own mother," Linda told her. "She was determined to see the world after my father passed, even when it meant traveling alone at 85. This connection sparked a brief conversation between Margaret and Linda, bridging the gap between strangers through shared experiences of loss and determination. James listened, understanding that his action had created more than just a rescue. It had facilitated human connections that might never have occurred otherwise. Robert MacLeod, the Scottish doctor who had volunteered his assistance, conducted a brief informal assessment of Margaret's condition. Her pulse was steady, her color good, and she showed no signs of serious medical distress. "I'd recommend taking it easier for the rest of the day," he advised. "Perhaps find somewhere quiet to sit and have a proper meal." The ceremony behind them was reaching its conclusion, with the formal inspection complete and the guards beginning their final movements. Sergeant Major Williams approached the group, his expression unreadable but his pace measured rather than urgent. James straightened slightly, recognizing the approach of his superior officer and understanding that the reckoning for his actions was about to begin. "Corporal Mitchell," Williams said formally, his voice carrying across the immediate area. The tourists quieted, sensing the gravity of this moment. "Status report." James stood at attention, or as close to it as he could manage while remaining near Margaret. "The civilian experienced what appeared to be a fainting episode, Sergeant Major. She has recovered and is stable, with medical assessment confirming no immediate concerns." Williams nodded, his experienced eyes taking in the scene, the recovered woman, the helpful tourists, the positive atmosphere despite the serious breach of protocol. His decision would be crucial not only for James's career but for setting a precedent about how the Guard would handle similar situations in the future. Very good, Corporal. Remain with the civilian until she is completely recovered and able to continue safely. Williams's words carried official approval that surprised both James and the watching crowd. The sergeant major had made a command decision that prioritized human welfare over rigid protocol adherence. Margaret looked up at both soldiers with gratitude that went beyond words. "I never expected such kindness," she said. "My husband always spoke about the honor and dignity of the British military, but I never imagined I would experience it so personally." Her words carried unexpected weight in the moment. Here was validation that James's instinctive decision had honored something deeper than ceremonial rules. It had embodied the values that the ceremony itself was meant to represent: the protection and service of the people, the commitment to something greater than oneself, the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. The crowd of tourists began to disperse as the official ceremony concluded, but many lingered to express their admiration for what they had witnessed. A family from Canada approached to thank James personally, their teenage daughter visibly moved by seeing someone choose compassion over conformity. An elderly gentleman from Wales shook James's hand, sharing that he was a veteran himself and proud to see such character in the younger generation of soldiers. Linda Patterson stayed close to Margaret, the two women having formed an instant bond over their shared experiences of widowhood and late-in-life adventures. "Would you like company for lunch?" Linda offered. "I was planning to find a nice pub somewhere nearby, and I hate eating alone when I'm traveling." Margaret's eyes brightened at the invitation. The morning's frightening experience was transforming into something unexpectedly positive. New friendships, human kindness, and memories that would be far more meaningful than the ceremonial display she had originally come to witness. James remained nearby as the women made their plans, ensuring Margaret was completely steady on her feet and confident in her recovery. His concern was genuine and personal now, extending beyond his military duties to simple human care for someone who had needed help when he was in a position to provide it. Constable Mackenzie approached James as the crowd continued to thin. "That was well done," she said quietly. "Not everyone would have made that choice, especially with so much at stake professionally." Her words carried the respect of one public servant for another, recognizing the courage required to prioritize human need over institutional expectations. Dr. McLeod also took a moment to speak with James before departing. "In my 40 years of medical practice, I've learned that the most important interventions are often the simplest ones, being there when someone needs help. You did exactly what any decent person should do, regardless of the uniform you were wearing." These affirmations from strangers carried unexpected weight for James. He had acted on instinct and conscience, unsure whether he was making the right choice. But the validation from people whose opinions he respected, the experienced police officer, the medical professional, the grateful woman he had helped, suggested that some decisions transcend institutional rules and speak to fundamental human values. Margaret stood slowly, testing her stability, and found herself steady and clear-headed. The combination of rest, water, food offered by generous tourists, and the kindness of strangers had restored both her physical strength and her emotional equilibrium. She looked at James with profound gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said. "You risked so much to help someone you didn't even know." James smiled, his formal military bearing softened by genuine warmth. "No thanks necessary, ma'am. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in London." He paused, then added, "And I hope your husband would be proud of your courage in making this journey." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than distress. "He would be proud of you too, young man. He always said the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone is watching, but what they do when it matters most." As the immediate crisis passed and normal activity resumed around the palace, James faced the reality of returning to his duties and confronting whatever consequences awaited him for his unprecedented action during the ceremony. The aftermath of James's decision unfolded in ways no one could have predicted. Within hours, amateur videos of the incident had been uploaded to social media platforms around the world. The footage showed a red-coated guard breaking formation to catch a falling elderly woman, then staying with her until she recovered. The contrast between rigid ceremonial protocol and spontaneous human compassion captured global attention. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself at the center of an unexpected adventure. Linda Patterson had indeed invited her to lunch, and the two women spent the afternoon in a traditional London pub, sharing stories about their late husbands and their courage in traveling alone later in life. What had begun as Margaret's solitary pilgrimage to fulfill a promise to Harold had transformed into a genuine friendship with a kindred spirit from across the Atlantic. "I can't believe how this day has turned out," Margaret said over fish and chips, her color completely restored and her appetite returned. "This morning I was just another tourist in the crowd, and now I feel like I've been part of something truly special." Linda smiled, raising her pint of bitter in a toast. "To unexpected heroes and new friendships," she said. "And to husbands who would be proud of the adventures we're having without them." Back at the palace, James faced a formal debriefing with his commanding officers. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the officer responsible for ceremonial duties, had been reviewing video footage of the incident and consulting with senior military leadership about appropriate responses. The situation was unprecedented. No guard in recent memory had broken formation during a ceremony, regardless of circumstances. "Corporal Mitchell," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison began, his tone professional but not harsh. "You understand the seriousness of your actions this morning. The changing of the guard ceremony has specific protocols that exist for important reasons: security, tradition, and maintaining the dignity of the crown." James stood at attention, prepared for disciplinary action. "Yes, sir. I understand completely, and I accept full responsibility for my decision to break protocol. However," the lieutenant colonel continued, "we must also consider the circumstances that led to your decision and the broader implications of both action and inaction in such situations." He paused, consulting notes from his conversations with senior officers. "Your immediate assessment was that a civilian was in medical distress and required assistance that was not being provided by others in the vicinity." "That is correct, sir," James replied. "The elderly woman was collapsing, and no one in the immediate area was responding to provide assistance." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. The military leadership faced a complex decision. Punishing James too harshly might send the message that rigid adherence to protocol mattered more than human welfare. But failing to address the breach could undermine discipline and encourage other guards to make independent decisions about when rules should be abandoned. "The situation has attracted considerable public attention," the lieutenant colonel observed. "Social media posts about the incident have been overwhelmingly positive, with many people expressing admiration for your quick thinking and compassion. International news outlets are requesting interviews, and the palace press office has received numerous inquiries." This information surprised James. His decision had been purely instinctive, focused entirely on helping Margaret. He hadn't considered how his actions might be perceived by others or what broader significance they might carry. The idea that people around the world were discussing his split-second choice felt surreal. Meanwhile, Margaret was discovering the extent of the attention their encounter had generated. Linda showed her various social media posts on her smartphone, including videos that clearly showed James's swift response and gentle care. The comments were unanimously positive, praising both his humanity and Margaret's gracious dignity throughout the incident. "Look at this," Linda said, scrolling through messages on Twitter. "People are calling him a silent hero and praising the British military for training soldiers who know when compassion matters more than protocol. Some are even calling you brave for traveling alone at your age to fulfill your husband's dream." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the positive attention. She had always been a private person, content to live quietly in Manchester without drawing notice. Now strangers around the world were discussing her morning adventure and expressing admiration for both her courage and James's kindness. Dr. Wency calls Tess available history. MacLeod, the Scottish physician who had assisted at the scene, had also become part of the growing narrative. A journalist from the BBC had contacted him for comment, and his professional assessment of the situation added medical credibility to James's decision. The young man's quick action potentially prevented serious injury, Dr. MacLeod told the reporter. "When someone is fainting, especially an elderly person, catching them before they hit hard pavement can prevent concussion, broken bones, or worse injuries." Constable Mackenzie faced similar media interest in her role as the police officer who had responded to the incident. Her statement to reporters emphasized the professionalism and quick thinking she had observed from Corporal Mitchell. He maintained situational awareness, provided appropriate assistance, and ensured the civilian received proper care while causing minimal disruption to the ongoing ceremony, she explained. These professional endorsements from medical and law enforcement personnel provided additional context for military leadership evaluating James's actions. Rather than a simple breach of protocol, the incident was being viewed as an example of appropriate crisis response and interdisciplinary cooperation. Back in Manchester, Margaret's sister Eleanor received an unexpected phone call that evening. Instead of the routine check-in they had planned, Margaret excitedly recounted her extraordinary day. The story of fainting during the ceremony, being caught by a guard, and making a new American friend sounded almost too remarkable to believe. "Are you absolutely certain you're feeling all right?" Eleanor asked, concerned that her sister might be minimizing health problems or the trauma of such a public incident. "I'm better than all right," Margaret assured her. "I feel like I've been reminded that there are still good people in the world, and that sometimes the most meaningful experiences come from completely unexpected places." Eleanor, who had worried about Margaret's decision to travel alone, felt a mixture of relief and pride. Her sister's voice carried a vitality and joy that had been missing since Harold's death. Whatever had happened in London that day had renewed something essential in Margaret's spirit. The military's final decision regarding James's actions came after consultations with senior leadership, legal advisors, and public relations experts. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called James into his office 3 days after the incident to deliver the verdict. "Corporal Mitchell, after thorough review of your actions and their circumstances, the decision has been made that no disciplinary action will be taken," he announced. "Furthermore, your quick thinking and compassionate response will be formally recognized in your service record as an example of sound judgment under pressure." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. The possibility of court-martial, demotion, or dismissal from the prestigious household division had weighed heavily on his mind since the incident. More importantly, the official endorsement of his decision validated his instinctive belief that some situations required prioritizing human welfare over institutional rules. However, the lieutenant colonel continued, "This recognition comes with additional responsibility. You will be expected to participate in media interviews and public events related to this incident, representing not only yourself, but the values and training of the British Army." This unexpected development would transform James from an anonymous ceremonial guard into a public figure representing military values and human compassion. The prospect was both exciting and daunting for the young corporal from Liverpool who had simply tried to help someone in need. The first major interview was scheduled with the BBC to be conducted at Buckingham Palace, with both James and Margaret participating. The reunion would be emotional for both of them, but it would also provide an opportunity to discuss the broader implications of the incident and what it revealed about contemporary military training and values. Margaret prepared for the interview with characteristic thoroughness, choosing the same navy blue dress she had worn to the ceremony and carefully organizing her thoughts about the experience. She wanted to ensure that James received proper recognition for his kindness and courage, and that the public understood how meaningful his actions had been to her personally. "I want people to know that he didn't just help me physically," she told Linda during one of their daily phone conversations that had continued since their London meeting. "He helped restore my faith in people, and reminded me that Harold's faith in human goodness was justified." The BBC interview, conducted by veteran journalist Sarah Williams, took place in the palace's staterooms, with appropriate ceremonial backdrop. Both Margaret and James had been nervous about the public attention, but their natural chemistry and genuine mutual respect created compelling television. "What went through your mind in that moment when you decided to break formation?" Sarah Williams asked James. "It wasn't really a decision in the traditional sense," James replied thoughtfully. "I saw someone who needed help, and every instinct told me to provide that help. The rules and protocols seemed much less important than making sure Mrs. Thompson was safe." Margaret, sitting nearby in an elegant chair, nodded approvingly. "He gave up everything he had worked for, potentially, to help a complete stranger. That kind of selflessness is rare in any circumstance, but particularly remarkable given how much his position meant to him." The interview explored broader themes about military service, the balance between duty and humanity, and the ways in which individual actions can reflect institutional values. James's articulate responses surprised many viewers who had expected a more formal, protocol-driven perspective from a ceremonial guard. "The military teaches us about service and sacrifice," James explained. "But the most important service is often the most personal, helping someone when they need it most, regardless of personal cost." Following the BBC interview, James received numerous speaking invitations from military academies, veteran organizations, and civic groups. His story had resonated with audiences far beyond the initial tourists who witnessed the incident, becoming a case study in ethical decision-making and moral courage. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself embracing a more active social life than she had maintained since Harold's death. Her brief fame had connected her with other widows who were pursuing late-in-life adventures, and she began planning additional trips inspired by her positive London experience. Linda Patterson visited Manchester 2 months later, and the friendship forged during that extraordinary day continued to enrich both women's lives. 6 months after the incident, James was promoted to sergeant and assigned additional responsibilities for training new ceremonial guards. His experience had demonstrated that the most important military values, courage, service, and sacrifice, sometimes required creative interpretation of traditional rules and protocols. "We teach our guards about precision, discipline, and following orders," James explained to new recruits during their orientation. "But we also teach them about judgment, compassion, and understanding when human need must take precedence over institutional procedure." The Silent Hero incident, as it had become known in military training circles, was incorporated into case studies about ethical decision-making under pressure. James's quick action had created a teaching moment that would influence guard training for future generations. Margaret returned to Buckingham Palace exactly 1 year after the original incident, this time as an invited guest of the Household Division. She watched the changing of the guard ceremony from a special viewing area, accompanied by Eleanor, Linda Patterson, and several other friends she had met through her newfound confidence in social situations. James, now wearing the stripes of a sergeant, was not standing guard that day, but was present in his new training capacity. He and Margaret exchanged warm greetings before the ceremony, two people whose lives had been permanently changed by a moment of human connection and moral courage. "Do you ever regret your decision that day?" Margaret asked him. James smiled, looking out at the crowd of international tourists gathering for the ceremony. "Never," he replied. "It taught me that sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones where we choose to act with our hearts instead of our heads, where we remember that rules serve people, not the other way around." As the ceremony began with its familiar pageantry and precision, both Margaret and James understood that they had become part of something larger than themselves, a story about human kindness, moral courage, and the ways in which individual actions can inspire others to act with greater compassion and understanding. The silent hero had found his voice, and Margaret had found the courage to embrace new adventures. Together, they had created a moment that reminded people around the world that genuine heroism often occurs in the smallest acts of kindness between strangers who choose to see each other's humanity above all else.